Harrelson Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. The year was 2081, and everyone was finally equal. They weren't only equal before God and law, they were equal in every which way. No one was smarter than anyone else. No one was better looking than anyone else. No one was quicker or stronger than anybody else. All this equality was due to the 211th, 212th, and 213th Amendments to the Constitution, and to the unceasing vigilant agents of the United States Handicapper General. Something about living still wasn't quite right, though. April, for instance, still drove people crazy by not being springtime. And it was in that clammy month that the HG men took George and Hazel Bergeron's 14th-year-old son Harrelson away. It was tragic, all right, but George and Hazel couldn't think about it very hard. Hazel had a perfectly average intelligence, which meant she couldn't think about anything except in short bursts. And George, while his intelligence was far beyond normal, he had a little mental handicap radio in his ear. He was required by law to wear it at all times. It was tuned to a government transmitter. Every 20 seconds or so, the transmitter would send out a very sharp noise to keep people like George from taking unfair advantage in their brains. George and Hazel were watching television. There were tears in Hazel's cheeks, but she had forgotten for a moment what they were about. On the television screen were ballerinas. A buzzer sounded in George's head. His thoughts fled in panic, like bandits from a burglar alarm. "It was a real pretty dance they just did," said Hazel. "Huh?" said George. "That dance, it was nice," said Hazel. "Yep," said George. He tried to think a little bit about the ballerinas. They weren't really very good, no better than anyone else would have been, anyway. They were burdened with sash weights and bags of birdshot, and their faces were masked, so that no one, seeing a free and graceful gesture or a pretty face, would feel something like the cat drug in. George was toying with the vague notion that maybe dancers shouldn't be handicapped, but he didn't get very far before another noise in his ear radio scattered his thoughts. George winced. So did 2 of the 8 ballerinas. Hazel saw him wince. Having no mental handicap herself, she had to ask George what the latest sound had been. "Sounded like someone hitting a milk bottle with a ball-peen hammer," said George. "I think it would be real interesting, hearing all the different sounds," said Hazel, a little envious. "All the things they think up." "Ugh," said George. "Only, if I was the handicapper general, you know what I would do?" said Hazel. Hazel, as a matter of fact, bore a strong resemblance to the handicapper general, a woman named Dana Moon Glampers. "If I was Dana Moon Glampers," said Hazel, "I would have chimes on Sunday. Just chimes. Kind of an honor to religion." "I could think if it was just chimes," said George. "Well, maybe make 'em real loud," said Hazel. "I think I'd make a good handicapper general." "As good as anyone else," said George. "Who knows better than I what a normal is?" said Hazel. "Right," said George. He began to think glimmeringly about his abnormal son who was now in jail, about Harrelson. But a 21-gun salute went off in his head and stopped the thought. "Boy," said Hazel, "that was a doozy, wasn't it?" It was such a doozy that George was still trembling. Tears stood down the rim of his red eyes. 2 of the 8 ballerinas had collapsed on the studio floor, holding their temples. "All of a sudden you look so tired," said Hazel. "Why don't you stretch out on a sofa, so you can rest your handicap bag on the pillows, honey bunch?" She was referring to the 47 pounds of birdshot in canvas bag which was padlocked round George's neck. "Go on and rest the bag for a little while," she said. "I don't care if you're not equal to me for a little bit." George weighed the bag in his hands. "I don't mind it," he said. "I don't notice it anymore. It's just a part of me." "You've been so tired. Kind of wore out," said Hazel. "If there was just some way I could make a little hole in the bottom of that bag, And just take out a few of those lead balls. Just a few. 2 years in prison and $2,000 fine for every ball I took out, said George. I don't call that a bargain. If you could just take out a few when you came home from work, said Hazel. I mean, you don't compete with anyone else around here. You just sit around. If I tried to get away with it, said George, then other people would get away with it. And pretty soon we'd be right back in the Dark Ages again, with everybody competing with everybody else. You wouldn't like that, would you? I'd hate it, said Hazel. There you are, said George. The minute people start cheating on laws, what do you think happens to society? If Hazel hadn't been able to come up with an answer to his question, George couldn't have supplied one. A siren went off in his head. Reckon it'd fall apart, said Hazel. What would? Said George blankly. Society, said Hazel uncertainly. Wasn't that what you just said? Who knows, said George. The television program was suddenly interrupted for a news bulletin. It wasn't clear at first what the bulletin was about, since the announcer, like all announcers, has serious speech impediment. For about half a minute, in a state of high excitement, the announcer tried to say, Ladies and gentlemen. He finally gave up, handed the bulletin to a ballerina to lead. That's all right, Hazel said to the announcer. He tried. It's a big thing. He tried to do the best he could with what God gave him. He should get a nice raise for trying so hard. Ladies and gentlemen, said the ballerina, reading the bulletin. She must have been extraordinarily beautiful, because the mask she wore was hideous, and it was easy to see that she was the strongest and most graceful of all the dancers, for her handicap bags were as big as those worn by 200-pound men, and she had to apologize at once for her voice, which was very unfair for a woman to use. Her voice was warm, luminous, timeless melody. Excuse me, she said, and she began to make her voice absolutely uncompetitive. Harrison Bergeron, age 14, she said, in a crackled squawk, has just escaped from jail, where he was held on suspicion for plotting to overthrow the government. He is a genius and an athlete. He is under-handicapped and should be regarded with extreme dangerousness. A police photograph of Harrison Bergeron was flashed on the screen outside the door. Upside down, then sideways, inside out, right side up again. The picture showed a full length of Harrelson against the background, calibrated in feet and inches. He was exactly 7 feet tall. The rest of Harrelson's appearance was a Halloween hardware. Nobody had ever borne heavier handicaps. He had outgrown hindrances faster than the G-men could think them up. Instead of having a little ear radio for a mental handicap, he wore a tremendous pair of earphones and spectacles with thick Levy lenses. The spectacles were intended to make him not only half-blind, but give him a wanging headache besides. Scrap metal hung all over him. Ordinarily, there was a certain symmetry, a military neatness to the handicaps issued to the strong people. But Harrelson looked like a walking junkyard. In a race of life, Harrelson carried 300 pounds. And an offset of his good looks, the HG men required he wear at all times a red rubber ball for a nose, keeping his eyebrows shaved off, and covering his white, even teeth with black caps at a snaggletooth random. If you see this boy, said the ballerina, do not, I repeat, do not try to reason with him. There was a shriek of the door being torn off the hinges. Screams and barking cries from custodians came from the television set. The photograph of Harrelson Bergeron on the screen jumped and again, as though dancing to the tune of an earthquake. George Bergeron correctly identified the earthquake as well as he might have, for many was the time his own home had danced to the same crushing tune. My God, said George, that must be Harrelson. The realization was blasted from his mind instantly by the sound of an automobile collision in his head. When George opened his eyes again, the photograph of Harrelson was gone, and a living, breathing Harrelson filled the screen. Clanking, clownish, and huge, Harrelson stood at the center of the studio. The knob of uprooted studio door was still in his hands. The ballerinas, technicians, musicians, and announcers cowered on their knees before him, expecting to die. "I am the Emperor," cried Harrelson. "Do you hear me? I am the Emperor, and everyone must do as I say at once." He stamped his foot, and the studio shook. "Even as I stand here," he bellowed, "crippled, hobbed, sickened, I am a greater ruler than any man who has ever lived. Now watch! Watch what I become!" Harrelson tore the straps of his handicap's harnesses like wet tissue paper. Tore straps graduated and support 5,000 pounds. Harrelson's scrap iron handicaps crashed to the floor. Harrelson thrusted his thumbs under the bar and the padlock that was secured his head harness. The bar snapped like celery. Harrelson smashed his headphones and spectacles against the wall. He flung away his rubber ball nose, revealed a man that would have been awed by Thor, the god of thunder. "Now, I shall select my empress," he said, looking down at the cowering people. "Let the first woman who dares rise to her feet and claim her mate and her throne." A moment passed, and a ballerina rose, swaying like a willow. Harrelson plucked the mental handicap from her ear, snapped off her physical handicaps with marvelous delicacy, and last of all removed her mask. She was blindingly beautiful. "Now," Harrelson said, taking her hand, "show the people the meaning of the word dance." "Music!" he commanded. The musicians scrambled back to their chairs, and Harrelson rid them of their handicaps too. "Play your best," he told them. "I'll make you dukes, barons, and earls." The music began. It was normal at first. Cheap, silly, false. But Harrelson snatched the two musicians from their chairs, waved them like batons, and he sang the music he wanted them to play, and slammed them back into their seats. This music began, and it was much improved. Harrelson and his empress merely listened to the music for a while. Gravely, as through synchronizing the heartbeats with it, they shifted their weights to their toes. Harrelson placed his big hands on the girl's tiny waist, letting her sense the weightlessness that would soon be hers. Then, in an explosion of joy and grace, into the air they sprang. Not only were the laws of the land abandoned, but the laws of gravity and the laws of motion as well. They reeled, whirled, swiveled, flanced, cambered, bamboed, and spun. They leaped like a deer on the moon. The studio ceiling was 30 feet high, but each leap brought the dancers nearer to it. It became their obvious intention to kiss the ceiling, and they kissed it. And then, gravity with love and pure will, they remained suspended in the air. Inches below the ceiling, they kissed each other for a long, long time. It was then that Dana Moon Clampers, the handicapper general, came into the studio with a double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun. She fired twice, and the Emperor and Empress were dead before they hit the floor. Dana Champers loaded the gun again. She aimed it at the musicians, told them they had 10 seconds to get their handicaps back on. It was then that Bergeson's television tube burnt out. Hazel turned to comment about the blackout to George, but George had gone out into the kitchen for a can of beer. George came back in with his can, paused a moment at the handicap signal shook him. He began to sit down. "You're crying," he said to Hazel. "Yep." "What about?" he said. "I forget," she said. "Something really sad on television." "What was it?" "It's all kind of mixed up in my mind," said Hazel. "Forget sad things," said George. "I always do," said Hazel. "That's my girl." George winced. There was a sound of a riveting gun in his head. "Gee, I could tell that one was a doozy," said Hazel.